Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Today, we're here to talk about CECLSolver. Time's almost up for CECL. See how CECLSolver can help. Before we begin, I would like to let you all know that we are in presentation mode. You can hear us, but we cannot hear you. If you have a question, please click on the question icon on your screen, and we will answer questions towards the end of the webinar. You will also receive an email with the slides from the webinar, along with a link to the recording for our YouTube channel. My name is David Suri, and I've been working with credit unions for 16 years on both the QR security side as well as Quick Rate, and now currently CECLSolver. We also have Steve Huntington, our Director of Quick Analytics, here today, who has been working with us for the last 20 years, and he has about 20 plus years experience with financial institutions. All right, let's talk about CECL. What was wrong with the incurred loss model? One of the comments we hear on our demo is, what's wrong with the current incurred loss model? Why the change? This all goes back to the last crisis, and in FASB's opinion, they felt the incurred loss model did a disservice to financial institutions by allowing them to not acknowledge losses until they were probable. The approach used to recognize impairment losses on financial assets has long been identified as a major weakness, resulting in delayed recognition of those losses. So at this point, FASB had a couple of options: fix the methodology or do nothing, knowing if you do nothing, the problem reoccurs. Then you expose yourself to people saying, well, why didn't you do anything to fix it? So clearly FASB decided that was not going to be their solution, so they decided to fix it, and CECL is that fix. This means learning a new way to calculate your reserve allowance. But at the end of the day, we are just calculating a reserve. We like to say we're playing the same game, just with a new set of rules. We're still going to focus on reserves. We're just going to go about it in a slightly different manner. So let's talk about the changes. I think you'll see here there are a number of areas where CECL and CECLSolver specifically can feel very similar to the way things have been done in the past with the incurred loss methodology. And one of those reasons we like, and for those reasons, we like the warm methodology, which has some similarities to the incurred loss model. First, CECL will be different in that we will be looking at losses over a longer life of the loan approach, instead of looking at losses over an annual or a couple of year look back period, which is what most institutions do now for their current ALLL. Now, you will make allowance for losses over the life of the loan. There are a number of similarities, as I mentioned. We're still going to look at a pool of assets and make qualitative factor adjustments and make assumptions for justifying those qualitative factor adjustments. So we're going to build on some of those similarities, but make a few slight changes along the way. First, there is no one singular mandatory method for calculating your reserve under CECL. NCUA has mentioned several different methodologies like the warm method, but the choice is completely up to you. You choose your path, and then you'll have to defend that to your examiners and absolutely understand where your final reserve number is coming from, and of course, document this appropriately. This will be the case for any tool or partner you decide to choose. NCUA has also stated that your chosen reserve methodology should match the complexity of the portfolio. For most traditional credit unions under a few billion in assets, a call report driven analysis using the warm methodology is perfectly acceptable. You do not need to engage in highly complex modeling or loan level analysis. When it comes to implementing CECL, there are some practical considerations. First, how much data have you collected? Do you have detailed loan level data going back at least 5 years? To do a more complex loan level analysis, you will need to have this data collected and reconciled before you even start your first actual reserve calculation, a process that can take a couple of years. For other warm options, what is the actual cost? Is it Excel-based? How much actual work do you think you'll have to allocate to calculating your reserve? Free options might not cost anything, but tend to be expensive when it comes to your time. How about data from outside your credit union? What do the loss trends look like in your state? How do your losses compare? Having good internal data is important, but having comparable peer data will be very helpful, especially in areas where you have little to no losses. Peer data can help to establish reasonable and supportable CECL reserves and further support your reserve figures. In the end, we feel that CECLSolver hits that perfect little balance of simplicity and automation, while still giving you the ability to add complexity when necessary. In the very beginning, we saw the original guidance for CECL. That guidance was for much more complex institutions that were more massive in asset size. And we knew that would not work for most credit unions across the country. So we set out to create a CECL tool that was easy to use, collected the relevant data for you, and to create a CECL tool that was just easy to understand and follow. We also wanted to create a CECL solution that was quick to implement and easy to maintain from month to month or quarter to quarter. We feel we've done exactly this with CECLSolver for credit unions, which brings us to the live demo. And with that said, I'll go ahead and turn the presentation over to Steve.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for joining us today. Give me just a second while I get my screen pulled up and we'll walk through a demo of the tool. David, let me know when that pops up.
There we go, Steve. I can see your screen just fine.
Excellent. So the first thing that you'll notice when we pull up our interactive tool is that the entire tool lives within the cloud, meaning that when you log in, since we have access to all of your historical balance sheet data and call report data from the Form 5300s, we start our initial segmentation around the buckets or segments or pools that we can get from the call reports. And the reason we do that is twofold. First off, it's a practical expedient in that when you first log in, your entire history of balances and charge-offs and recoveries and past dues by segment is already preloaded into the system. So you don't spend any time reconciling your accounts and worrying about the historical data trends because they're already here. The second part about having the tool in the interactive environment is that whenever you change any input or assumption into the tool, the entire math recalculates on the fly. So you get instantaneous feedback as to which assumptions or inputs that you're changing, how much they move the needle, and whether they're particularly relevant to your situation or relatively irrelevant. As David mentioned, we're heavily utilizing the weighted average remaining maturity, or the WARM method for short. It's certainly one of the more straightforward methodologies that's been vetted and approved for CECL compliance for the vast majority of credit unions out there. We have some elements of the open pool snapshot methodology here as well, but it's the majority, it's a WARM-based method. Now, the first step in doing a WARM-based method, or honestly any methodology for CECL, we can't really get around having to do some average remaining maturity calculations on our portfolio. Since CECL at its heart is all about estimating losses over the remaining lives of the assets or the pools, we got to get a feel for what the remaining lives of those pools are. Now, I know that's not something that's directly calculated on your call reports. Nowhere on the 5300 does it have a line item asking you to calculate average remaining maturities. So that's something that we need to work with you guys on the front end to calculate and plug into the tool so that it's then sort of off and running from a data perspective. Now, the easiest solution for calculating WARMs is to simply go to your core or your ALM and ask and see if there's any reports that they can run for you that can do some WARM calculations. Sometimes that's the case. A lot of times it's certainly not something we expect them to be able to help you with. And so lots of times it's either up to you to do the WARM calculations internally or get some assistance from us. So as much or as little help as you need doing those WARM calculations, we can provide. Whether it's providing a spreadsheet, we have what we call an Excel-based WARM estimator tool down here that you can download and save locally on your systems that shows you exactly how you would do a WARM calculation by call report code for CECL. Pretty much just a lot of cutting and pasting of loan level data into the tool and doing average remaining life calculations. Now, if that's not something that you have the time or energy or inclination to manage internally, we can do it for you. We can set up a secure room where you can upload your loan files, the Aries file, if you will, on a quarterly basis, and then we can handle the WARM calculations and provide them to you. So let's assume for now that we've gotten some WARM calculations and we're ready to go ahead and start building a scenario for CECL. I'm going to go ahead. So the guinea pig we're using for today is a larger credit union out of Wisconsin, I believe. And so if we're going to pick a specific loan category and kind of follow the whole thing through so you can see how the math works, we'll go ahead and do that. So let's say we had calculated that the average remaining life of our new vehicle loans was 3.5 years. As soon as we plug in 3.5 years here into the tool, everything recalculates, takes about 2 seconds, and everything recalculates on the fly across the board as it pertains to CECL for new vehicle loans. Now, what I mean by all that is if we know that the average remaining life of our new vehicle loans is 3.5 years, we know what CECL is really requiring of us is that we project 3.5 years worth of losses on this segment going forward, right? Losses over the remaining life of the pool. Now, if we're going to project 3.5 years into the future, our tool, at least by default, takes a symmetrical view of the look back period, meaning that we're going to look at a 3.5 year period in your past and analyze that historical experience over that lifetime 3.5 year look back period, looking at how your balances have changed, how you've accumulated charge-offs and recoveries over that time period, what direction those trends are headed in. We get all that information to establish the first big piece of the puzzle, sort of the baseline for CECL, and that is what is our credit union's historical lifetime or life of the loan loss rate on the segment. So for this particular credit union for new vehicle loans over 3.5 year WARM, it's 35 basis points. Now, a lot of math obviously goes on behind the scenes to get to that 35 basis points. Luckily for us, it is all captured right here in the historical analysis tab. This is a more detailed tab where you can get the supporting information that goes into that summary calculation on the results tab. This is where we're tracking those balances, charge-offs, recoveries, and doing those calculations over time. This tab, again, the first time you ever log into the tool, all this data will be sitting here for your credit union. Whenever we get new call report data from you and from your peer group, these columns and the data gets updated as soon as it's available. If we're going to look at the new vehicle loans, let's take a look there first. I can scroll back and go even further back in time than I need to if I want, but we see the last 3.5 years here is highlighted. So we just kind of give a visual highlight to the look back period for each segment of the portfolio. Gives you a better feel for where you have longer durations and shorter durations within the portfolio. But we can see here over the last 3.5 years, this credit union has averaged about $50 million in new vehicle loans. Then we can head down here and we can see a lot of the detail on charge-offs and recoveries in dollars and percentages by call report segment. We have it split up two ways. We have legacy segmentation data and updated segmentation data. That comes because, and we'll talk about this more in a few minutes, the massive changes that the NCUA did to the call reports in the first quarter. They pretty much did a complete overhaul of asset quality data in the call reports in the first quarter of this year. There used to be a total of 9 additive segments of the portfolio when it came to charge-offs, recoveries, and past dues. If you remember, we always had a bunch of those sort of memo items, but those memo items were, quote, included in above and weren't really additive, so didn't really give us good discrete buckets to work from. We, of course, originally built our tool in that environment with those available segments, and we have a lot more data now starting in March 31st of this year. The call reports now have 20 completely discrete and additive segments of the loan portfolio from a past due and a charge-off and a recovery standpoint. So we certainly wanted to utilize that additional granularity, but then getting long-term historical trends when it's a mix of apples and oranges segmentation-wise was certainly a challenge for us to do that data mapping. But we've done it, and you get to take advantage of the results of it. If you ever wanted to go through exactly what all that looked like, we're happy to do that on a one-off basis with anyone on the call here, and I'll have a couple slides later on in the presentation after we're done with the live demo here where you'll see how some of that data has shifted. But we can track the balances over time, the charge-offs and recoveries, and you see down here at the bottom for the updated segmentation what those loss ratios, annual loss ratios look like, and then, excuse me, what the lifetime loss rate is for this particular credit union, and it's 35 basis points for the new vehicle loans. So if I head back to the summary here, that's where that 35 basis points come from. And that's pretty much the first half of CECL. At this point, we haven't considered looking outside your 4 walls to the environment around you. We haven't considered economic data. We've just looked at and analyzed your historical experience. So where all the rest of that comes in is the qualitative factor adjustments, right? That's the second half of CECL. It's all those reasons that you have to believe that current and future conditions might be a little bit different from the historical conditions, which resulted in these loss rates that we just finished calculating. Now, this is where we click on the Q Factors tab, and this is where we can start entering all of our details and our explanations for and justification for our various qualitative factor adjustments. Now, this part of CECL does not have to be necessarily very different conceptually from what you've been doing under the current methodologies, right? Under the incurred loss. We have some different environmental or qualitative, external or environmental factors that you can take advantage of here, including making adjustments to your historical experience based upon peer data, which we'll go into detail on in just a minute, based upon economic data or any other external factors. And then here you'll notice we have sort of pre-filled the Q factors table in here with all of those suggested qualitative factor adjustments that came from the existing interagency guidance on the ALLL. So, you know, for more than 20 years, we've had this interagency guidance that asks us to at least consider factors such as changes in lending policies and procedures and loan review systems and credit concentrations, et cetera, et cetera. So we have all those pre-built in here. You can make adjustments when and where you see fit. If a particular adjustment simply does not apply at all, and it's not one that you guys want to take into account, you can remove that adjustment completely. So I just click on the little trash can there and it removes that column completely. You can also add any completely custom adjustments that you want here in the custom tabs, and you can add additional columns as you see fit. So it's very flexible from that perspective, but it allows you to make all the different qualitative factor adjustments that you want, and then the tool will sum up all those adjustments for a net qualitative factor adjustment, and then allows you an administrative tool here where you start kind of building your narrative or your justification for the assumptions that you've made here from a Q factor standpoint. This helps not only in an audit trail or in an exam process, but also just when you come back to the tool next month or next quarter or whenever and want to update it. This is, you know, for you to remind yourself, you know, what you were thinking when you made the adjustments last time and whether those assumptions still hold true or if they need to be modified a bit. You'll notice here on the right, we have a couple charts. as we change assumptions in the tool, the charts sort of update on the fly. So I can click around through the portfolio and I can see our long-term trend in losses, that's the blue bars, our peer group's long-term trend in losses, that's the green line. The gray shaded area here represents the look back period that we're utilizing in order to start estimating CECL. And then the orange line is the total CECL estimate for that segment based upon all the inputs. So if I came in here and made a large qualitative factor adjustment there, you can see everything, the chart sort of updates in front of your eyes, so to speak, and brings the CECL allowance up higher as it recalculates or on the fly. Everything in the tool, you'll notice whenever I'm on any tab updating any inputs or assumptions, not only does everything recalculate, but all the different pages are linked and synced, so to speak. So if you make a change here and then you come back to the summary, there's that net qualitative factor adjustment that I just made on the Q factors tab, already pretty much sitting here in the summary tab. So you don't have to worry about making sure everything is apples to apples. It all links and syncs interactively. Now, once we've made all of our qualitative factor adjustments and made notes on them by segment, by the way, once you make these notes, they get attached to the risk pool throughout the analysis. Whenever we save the scenario or export it or print it off, each of the notes gets attached to the segment in the exports and the print offs and the scenario, so that you can always track that and you never lose that. Heading back to the summary, once we've made those adjustments, then we see we've pretty much arrived at a expected future loss rate. It's simply your historical experience plus or minus the sum total of all the ways you think it might be different is equal to your expected future lifetime loss rate going forward. Now, once we have that, we need to apply that to the current loan portfolio balance. By default, we pull up the most recent quarter end because that's what we have available from the call reports, but that does not limit how often you use the tool or when you run it as of. You can come in here and update those balances, override the quarter end with month end or yesterday's GL or as current as you want it to be, and then the analysis will be as of that specific date that you plug in the current balances. Then we need to, if any of these balances need to be modified, to net out any loan balances that are outside the scope of CECL or government guaranteed, for example, like if you had any PPP or COVID loans still on the books, or if you had any sizable government guaranteed portion of SBA program loans, anything that's kind of, if there were to ever be a loss, it wouldn't be coming out of your loan loss reserve or your ACL. We certainly don't need to provide or reserve for those balances. Would also include fully share secured balances. And once we've made any adjustments there, we can certainly pull something out and make a note of it here that we netted out, $1 million of fully share secured and the all other unsecured loans. So just another area to leave those notes so that we can track all the assumptions we're making. Now, the last thing we need to worry about before doing the calculation, the final CECL calculation for each segment is, are there any loans in that bucket that need to be assessed on an individual basis? So we have a template here that can walk you through kind of any loans that you need to individually assess. People ask us on a daily basis, what is the threshold going to be for when loans need to be culled from the herd and pulled out of the collective pools and dealt with on an individual basis? Unfortunately, there is no real great guidance on that yet. It's going to be a bit of a trial and error process. The old standard of the TDR is going away. The way that impaired loans were defined under the old standard is the concept of impairment doesn't go away, but the threshold is not going to be the same as it was because we don't have the language from FAS 5 and FAS 114 to go on anymore, because those FAS 5 and 114 are ceased to exist and are replaced with the CECL standard. So what the threshold is as to when we need to, when a loan has no longer is similar to any other loan in your portfolio and needs to go here, is a bit of anyone's guess at this point, as challenging as that, unsatisfying as that sounds. But I think we're going to get a lot more guidance about that as we move into next year. But we certainly have the tool is flexible to manage those individually assessed loans. It will pull them out of the collective pool so that we're not double counting or losses on them, which is the critical element here. And once we've done that, we pretty much we can calculate a implied CECL for the pool. We add it all up and we get an implied CECL reserve for the entire collective pool. Then we add in any reserve we need on held to maturity securities, which we have a separate tab here for. This is a pretty small piece of the puzzle, or a negligible piece of the puzzle for probably most of you on the call. CECL does require that we deal with all assets that are carried at amortized cost, which does include the held to maturity debt securities. Now, most of you, if you have any of them, they're typically mostly government guaranteed or sponsored type entities, and so they don't really have any credit risk. But if you do have any real corporate debt on the books that does have an actual risk of credit or credit risk, then you can account for it here, and it will also factor into the overall CECL calculation. This is where the reserve for the individually assessed loans comes back into play. And then last but not least is any surplus for or shortfall for unfunded commitments. So this is another pretty small piece of the puzzle for most credit unions, but it's not negligible. Starting next year on the call reports, there will be a line item requiring you to calculate a potential an ACL for off-balance sheet credit exposures. And so we will have to deal with it because it will be something we'll have to plug into the Form 5300s. Now, the way you go about doing it, we can find your total unfunded commitments from your call reports and preload them in here. We will work with you to figure out which of those unfunded commitments meet the definition of unconditionally cancelable. Any of those, things like credit card lines, are always pretty much the definition of unconditionally cancelable. Overdraft protection commitments are typically also, and some HELOCs. So it's you kind of got to go through and think about each pool. But once we net those out, whatever's left over, the net unfunded commitment, that's the balance that we have to at least deal with from a CECL perspective. And then we have to jump through a couple of mental hoops here, because what they're asking you to do in effect is, project long-term future losses on loans that don't even really exist yet, right? So it's a little hypothetical, but we start with estimating the probability of funding, which we walk you through and discuss some default values for and where we found them from in the NCUA's risk-based capital guidelines. And then you estimate what the remaining life of the commitments are. And then if they were to be funded, what kind of losses might we see from them if they were to be funded? So those are the steps that we need to take here, and we kind of help you through it as much as we can and come up to a certain value that you'll also have to deal with from a CECL perspective on the balance sheet. Again, for most credit unions, it's a very small number from a dollar perspective, so it's not something I would spend weeks pulling my hair out about at this point, but we do have a tool to help you with it when you get to that point. So once we've taken into account all those factors, we pretty much know what our total CECL requirement is going to be, and we can compare it to our current reserve, our current ALLL reserve at any point in time, and the tool will let you know what your surplus or shortfall looks like it is as of that date, as of these current loan balance dates. Now, this is obviously something that's going to evolve a little bit as we start next year. We're not going to be showing shortfalls versus other methodologies. We'll simply be showing what your current reserve is, or the last one that you publicly announced, and then what your reserve needs to be now, current one, and then any difference is going to be, what your how you provision for it on the income statement to get the reserve and keep it where it needs to be after the day one accounting adjustment that we'll all make or most of us will make come January. Those are the steps of how the tool works on sort of a step-by-step basis. You'll notice here that we do right front and center, we have a column that shows what the peer weighted average is. And that's just because, the greatest help we can be and assistance we can be in the qualitative factors tab is providing some really good apples to apples environmental data. So many of you on the call will probably be in a situation where at least one of your segments of your portfolio might have absolutely no losses over an extended period of time, right? You might have no mortgage charge-offs at all over the last 6, 7, 8 years. And we know we're not going to get away with having zero reserve for our mortgage portfolio just because we haven't seen any losses there in a dog's age. And so that's when we can really utilize that peer data to go outside your four walls and look at the environment around you for some supporting information to help justify whatever Q factor you're inevitably going to have to put in there for your mortgage portfolio. So you'll be able to say, we analyzed our own portfolio. We haven't seen any losses there in a very long time, But because of that, we looked at every other first lien mortgage loan for similar size credit unions in our state or in our region. And we looked at their long-term loss performance experience and history and averaged them out. So we know that even though, let's say, we've seen 0 losses, our peers are averaging 30 basis points over the last 6 years over a lifetime loss rate historical period. That gives you a lot more justification for starting to explain where those Q factors and that future expected loss are coming from if they're not coming from your own historical data. So the way we do that is when we were doing this historical analysis on your credit union, looking at your balances by segment, going back in time, 15 years plus, looking at charge-offs and recoveries trends, we were not just doing this analysis for your credit union, we were also doing it for every single other credit union in your peer group simultaneously in the background. So crunching millions and millions of call report numbers in order to get to this. What this tab represents is those same loss rates by segment using the same segmentation we're using for you, but a weighted average for the credit unions in your peer group. And then we overlay your custom look back periods in order to calculate lifetime loss rates that are completely apples to apples comparable to your historical lifetime loss rates. Now, when I say your peer group, what do I mean by that? You can certainly choose, you can customize your peer groups to an extent here. We start by using your NCUA peer group. So the NCUA, organizes credit unions into one of 6 peer groups by asset size. The smallest ones, peer group 1, those are the guys under 2 million in total assets, all the way up to peer group 6, which is all the credit unions $500 million and above. This credit union is over 500 million, so they're in peer group 6, which is why we've defaulted to them. So we default to your NCUA peer group, and then we allow you to zoom in or out geographically to be more or less specific from that standpoint. I typically suggest starting with a state or regional focus and then zooming out to a national focus if you think there's just not enough sample size in a state or regional scope. But if you get enough of a sample size in your state or region, that's probably a better place to start, just because it gives you more local data, right? If you're a credit union in Wisconsin, you really don't care how bad losses on used vehicle loans were in Southern California 5 years ago. What matters to you is the types of loans that have gone bad in your neck of the woods, in your market, how bad they got and when they went bad, and how they're performing now. So starting with a more zoomed in focus geographically is probably a good best practice, but we allow you to kind of zoom in and out at will and change asset size as well. If you're kind of on the border between, let's say you're $52 million in assets, and you operate like a little smaller of a credit union, you might want to compare yourself to the $10 to $50 million credit unions as opposed to the $50 to $100 million credit unions, which you're technically in the peer group of. So it allows you to kind of scroll down one and kind of jump down or up a size range bucket in order to see peer data at that slightly larger or smaller average size. And just doing that, honestly, playing around with the different peer groups and then seeing how the peer data trends change over time by segment gives you a really good insight into what happens with credit unions in your neck of the woods as they grow. If you're curious about, well, we're rapidly growing and we're going to be over 100 million pretty soon and continuing on past there, what is the experience of credit unions in our state as they get larger as it pertains to new vehicle loan losses, right? Do larger credit unions tend to have higher losses on new vehicle loans than smaller credit unions in Wisconsin or in your state? You can start asking these questions and answering them almost in real time by utilizing the peer data in our tool. All that being said, once you've got a scenario the way you want it, you want to make sure that you save that as a new scenario, give it a name, give it a date, and save it. You can as soon as you save the scenario here, you can access it anytime you want to. That data is saved securely on the cloud on our servers. You can save as many scenarios as you want. There's no limit to how far this drop-down box will go down. And honestly, as a best practice, that's what we suggest, is that whenever you have new data, save it as a new scenario so that this becomes a repository of all your saved scenarios over time, right? Historically intact and accurate as of when you saved them. So 6 months from now, you can come back and compare your reserve to what it was 6 months ago. Do an annual comparison under CECL and see exactly what's changed. By toggling between the scenarios, you can see pretty much within a few seconds why the number's different if it's markedly different. I've seen some tools that are very kind of overly complex and a little bit burdensome from an output standpoint or a tool management standpoint, so that if you see a big change in your reserve, it takes you forever to kind of reverse engineer what assumption you changed to really move the needle and made that change. And those are going to be questions you'll be asked, certainly by auditors or examiners or your board, whenever something changes significantly. So you'll need to know what that assumption was that changed that had such an impact. And with our tool, it's something you can do very, very, very quickly and effectively. Once you have saved scenarios and it's time to share this data externally as a report, you have full control over exporting the tool, whether you just want to export a quick summary for your board on a quarterly basis or something, or whether it's a full-on audit and you want the whole kit and caboodle, but you have control over that. And if let's say I wanted summary data and I wanted some peer data, and I just wanted, the Q factors, and I want that as a PDF, I can click PDF, and it takes just a couple seconds, generates a PDF. Here's a summary tab. Here is the peer data trends that we saw, and then here's the qualitative factor adjustment summary, and then any notes and stuff that we made by segment for the Q factor. So that's how you can export different parts of a tool to a PDF. You can also export it directly into an Excel environment if you so prefer. The great thing about the Excel environment exports is that it allows you pretty much ultimate flexibility to make other notes and move stuff around, do some additional analysis directly within the file. So you see, all the visual formatting sort of translates to the Excel file here, including the shaded look back periods and everything else. And you can make notes on, additional notes on your Q factors. You can make notes not by segment, but by Q factor adjustment, so to speak. If you want to make one set of notes about all your adjustments for economic conditions, you could do it here and resave it. So you have some flexibility in the Excel environment for adding rows, columns, doing your own math, and ancillary analyses that you might need to do. And at this point, that's about everything I wanted to make sure I covered here on the tool. We start by default, again, by using the segments that we get from the call reports. If you need some additional segmentation, you can add custom risk pools here. You'll certainly have to do a little bit more legwork in the historical analysis part of that because, well, if you're adding a custom risk pool, it's by definition, it's not based upon the call report data. And so we won't have access to all the data needed to calculate the historical loss rates for you. We can certainly work with you to get them calculated. So you can add some flexibility there. You also have some flexibility with the look back periods. If you want to use a different 3-year period instead of the most recent 3 years for your unsecured loans, for example, you can come in here and shift the look back period to a different 3-year period, for example, like I just did there. And so you have some other ways to kind of customize and use the tool in a more flexible manner. We always have a bunch of resources that go along with the tool. A visual user guide that's very much a step-by-step guide reminding you of how to use the tool, best practices, some methodology help as well, some policy language here in the draft of an implementation letter you can utilize when you're kind of reformatting your reserve policy to make it CECL compliant from the old school ALLL version. Another link to our Excel-based warm estimator tool. You can use that as much or as little as you need to get those warm calculations done. This we'll talk about in a second. We have some prepayment assumption guidance that we put together too, because that's a challenging, that's certainly an assumption, and it's an assumption that has a big impact on your CECL reserve. And there's no right way, one way to do it. It's subjective, of course, just like everything else in CECL. Here's the results of our recent SOC type 1 report, just if you need that from a due diligence or a model validation perspective on us. And then here are some external resources, some links to some better presentations we've seen over the years by FASB and the various regulatory bodies that discuss CECL in general, that discuss the WARM method more specifically, and its appropriateness for typical credit unions in CECL compliance. So hopefully, if you want some, it's not exactly light reading, I would call it, but certainly some ways to get more comfortable with the methodology that we use and coming right from the horse's mouth, so to speak. At this point, I'm going to turn the presentation back over to David Surrey. The first few slides here, I know we just did this in a live environment, but if you all want to be printing this presentation off and sharing it internally in the credit union or anything else, or just downloading it as a PDF, I wanted to make sure I had some actual slides that covered a summary of the tool. So right here over the, just briefly, I'll go through these again, David. You can see this is just the summary tab that we have on the tool with some notes about how the tool works. On the next slide, yeah, this just reminds you kind of how to manage the tool from saving scenarios and exporting the tool and using the user guide, and then making use of those notes. Again, as a best practice, you'll never, we hear it every day from the auditors and from the examiners that since there's so much that is subjective in here, this entire process, when it comes down to it, is about making a ton of reasonable assumptions and having some sort of justification for those assumptions. So if whether your Q factor adjustment is 0.2% or 1.2% is probably less important than the narrative that you attach to how you got to 1.2 or 0.2. There's no preconceived, expectation that they have that you've got to get to 1% or you've got to get to 75 basis points. Probably, from a practical standpoint, what we see a lot of is, CECL wasn't the idea of the NCUA. So they were sort of dragged along, kicking and screaming along the way, just like everybody else has, because this is an accounting pronouncement. So when we talk to the NCUA and we see their examiners come in and start talking to credit unions about CECL, from a practical standpoint, we're playing the same game, as David said, with the same people and just a slightly different set of rules. So in many cases, they're going to look at what your reserve currently is. They're going to look and make sure that your methodology for CECL is sound, that it's an approved way of going about or thinking about reserves from a lifetime loss rate type standpoint. And then they're going to say, look, the math seems to check out. It looks like you've used an appropriate way to get to this number. Now see if you can find a way to make it not so different from what your current reserve is, because we always thought that was pretty adequate. Hint, hint, wink, wink. And so you all get my drift as to how that conversation goes a lot of the time. So what you need is a tool that's going to be flexible enough and practical enough that you can make and change assumptions and see exactly what impact it's going to have and make notes along the way so that you can present it in an intelligent, rational manner to your examiner and your auditor, and then move on with life, right? We're doing all this for one number on our call report. Yes, it's an important number, but this is still, when it comes down to it, this is a projection of the future. They're asking you to guess what the future holds. And so they're all aware that this is an estimation. And so we don't need to overdo it. We really don't need to overdo it here unless you're a really large, really complex credit union. And so that's why we kind of developed the tool the way we did. And we certainly didn't do it in an echo chamber or in a vacuum. Pick your slogan there. We worked with FASB. We worked with the NCUA, with the chief, accountants over there in developing the tool, getting their feedback along the way. The NCUA is very well aware of our tool and how it works. And, they're never going to endorse a product. That's just not something that they do, which is fine. But just so that everyone is comfortable with, the way we go about the calculations, it certainly is something the NCUA has vetted and looked at quite carefully. Next slide, David. Just a couple more quick slides here that just remind you, that kind of take you through the tool. I'm not going to go through these in detail because I already did on the live demo, but they're there for you in black and white. So skip ahead. This is where that all those Q factor adjustments I was talking about that are sort of pre-built as choices into the system. This is that interagency guidance that we've had for decades now that suggests that you should at least consider these specific types of adjustments. So that's where that's coming from if you were curious. Keep moving. That's just individually assessed loans, and then the HTM securities, and then a little bit about peer data, just because people are always asking, well, that's fine. I'm in NCUA peer group 6 and I'm in California. So who else? How many other credit unions are there? Is this a group of 10 or is this a group of 80? And so, we realized, well, hey, we've got we've downloaded every call report that every credit union has ever filed, and we're continuing to do so moving forward. Wouldn't it be great if we had just some basic financial data outside of the credit data from a CECL perspective that we could provide, just to give you a little bit of a dashboard on absolute and relative performance for credit unions. So we built a couple other tools here that you get, for free just by having access to subscribing to the CECL tool, where you can look at your financial performance over time, over short terms, over long terms. You can download and export the data, and you can look at that data not just for yourself, but for any other credit union in the country. So you can search for a credit union and just get some of this financial data in a clean, practical, comparable format. We also have this other tool we call just kind of a universe at a glance. This is where you can get a snapshot of the other credit unions that are in your peer group and what they look like. So if you pull this up, it'll default to your state and your size, and you can, if you go back one more slide to that for just another second there. You can see you can search by state, search by region, and you can sort by any one of those columns. You just click on the column and sort by it. So if you want to see all the other $50 to $100 million credit unions in your state, you can see them right there, and then take a look at their performance. And then you can click on their name. You notice on the left there, they're all blue. You can click on any of those names, and it'll take you to a financial homepage for that credit union, so you can get some more data on them. So just a good filtering tool, kind of snapshot financial performance tool that we thought would be helpful. Next slide. Last thing, so I did want to point out, when I talked about all the new call report data for asset quality in the first quarter, most of you are probably familiar with that because you were probably involved in the call report generation process, but this is a summary slide that just explains how that all the changes that happened in the first quarter with asset quality data. And the next two slides are a visual representation of that. So right there, all the red is new. So on the left, that's what we used to have for charge-offs, recoveries, past dues by segment, not including the memo items, of course, because they're not additive. Now on the right, everything that's red is brand new. And on the next slide there, David, this is past due data, past due by segment. Everything red is new. So pretty much 80% of all the asset quality data we're getting from call reports is brand new starting March of this year. So there's going to be a transition period where you're having to deal with old data buckets and new data buckets. But moving forward, we're going to have more and more of this new data over time, and it is more granular, and I think it's a better format. I just wish they hadn't have decided to make that change right in the middle of CECL planning, because it was poor timing. But yeah, we won't get into that. Now, last thing I wanted to point out is some help on prepayment assumptions. If you're having challenges doing warm calculations, then which a lot of credit unions that you wouldn't be uncommon. That's a typical issue to have. Prepayments are another level of complexity, right? Because you have to track individual loans throughout different periods. It's not as easy as just taking call report data, which you can do for warms. You can't do it at all for a prepayment assumption. So unless you have some really good prepayment studies for speeds done by your ALM or your core that you can request, it's usually, the juice usually isn't worth the squeeze to spend a huge amount of time digging through your own loan level data to try to get segment level prepayment studies done. Because even if you were to do all that, and that can take a very large amount of time, that still isn't what they're asking for. They're asking not for what your prepayment speeds looked like a year ago in a specific environment. They're asking for what your long-term assumption for future prepayment speeds is going to be when we don't even know what the economic environment is going to be 2 years from now. So a much better approach, more defensible approach, and it just so happens a lot easier of an approach, is to look at industry trends, right? Find what kind of prepayment data is out there over a long term historically, and start with that as a default assumption. So we went and found some good resources that you can utilize in order to defend some prepayment assumptions that you use in your warm calculations. So if you go to the next slide, David, the FHFA publishes what they call a prepayment monitoring report. Sounds pretty good. On a quarterly basis, it provides really good data on trends in prepayment speeds for all Fannie and Freddie mortgage loans across the country, for all different coupons and remaining terms, et cetera. And you can see how those have changed over time. And if you took long-term averages of those prepayment speeds, you would find somewhere in the range of 15 to 20% is typically what we see as a long-term average for prepayment speeds for mortgage-related loans. So that's the link is there. You can utilize that document. I think it's a great one to use. On the next slide, David, just shows you this is probably the best single chart from that document, because it shows what we're looking for. This is a 1 month CPR, which is CPR stands for conditional or sometimes constant prepayment rate. It is already annualized, so it's exactly the type of number that we need to adjust our WARMs to be prepayment adjusted. And if you don't make any prepayment assumption, you are likely going to be shooting yourself in the foot for CECL, because what do prepayments do? They take our WARMs and they make them lower, right? You have a shorter estimated life if you're once you take into account prepayments. And the shorter the remaining life of your portfolio, the lower your reserve typically needs to be, right? Because we all aggregate losses over time. And since CECL requires us to estimate losses over the remaining life, the shorter the remaining life, the smaller the number of losses that they're likely to take over that time. And so we don't want to ignore or underestimate needlessly prepayment assumptions, thereby likely overestimating our CECL reserves. So that's a good place to start right here. And then for other things, for non-mortgage related loans, for the rest of your portfolio, obviously the FHFA is not going to be particularly helpful. So we did find some industry guidance from the Federal Reserve. They came up with a bunch of prepayment assumptions they used for different loan types when they designed the TALF facility after the last credit crisis, that they continued updating on their website. So there's a link there for that. And they give these are monthly prepayment assumptions. They're based on an ABS, which is an absolute prepayment speed methodology, but it's a monthly that we have to then annualize to make it relevant to calculating annual loss rates or annual prepayments. So you multiply those by 12, and just by a stroke of luck, that they end up somewhere in that 15 to 20% range on average for long-term averages for non-mortgage related loans too. So we've just feel with the more research we do that a starting point somewhere in that 15 to 20% range for most of your portfolio segments is a good defensible place to start. If you have your own internal data, want to do your own prepayment studies, great, go ahead. And compare that to these and then make modifications where you need to. But again, our tool in our Excel-based WARM estimator tool, it allows you to tweak prepayment assumptions and then recalculate WARMs on the fly. So any other questions about that, feel free to just contact us after the call today. David?
And I'll jump in here. As far as WARM support, we can do as Steve mentioned earlier, your WARM calculations for you. And for most of our credit unions, we have at this point 300 plus credit unions that are using CECLSolver. For the most part, most of those credit unions are using our service as a way of calculating the WARM for them, because like as Steve mentioned very early on, it takes about 50% of the work load off of you. There's very little information that we need as far as calculating that WARM, and that is something we'd go over with you individually, but it boils down to the current balance and the maturity date. For different types of loans like lines of credit, there's a little bit more information, actual payment information that we would ask from you. But again, the point being is we can do this calculation for you, so you can concentrate on making those qualitative factor adjustments for your reserve allowance. Your next steps would just be simply to get in touch with us if you want more information on pricing. It is asset-based, so it is going to be different for every single credit union on the call today. Again, it's something that either myself or Jason Heinrich can get you very easily. As far as the cost, if you need any due diligence, we'd be happy to provide that as well, or a sample report with your actual numbers in it. We can run through some examples and send that to you as well. Our next coffee talk will be October 14th at 11:30 Eastern. It is a forum where Steve and Sean O'Brien, our president, have more of a community type atmosphere where our credit unions can ask a lot of questions. We do have topics that we're going over. There's a brief summary of what CECLSolver can do to help, but it's more of a a conversation about CECL and how we can help our credit unions best manage that. So again, please reach out to us if you'd like. Also, everybody will be getting an email that attended today as far as today's webinar recording, which links you to our YouTube channel where that lives. So if you'd like to watch the entire presentation, the PowerPoint, I believe, will be sent as well in a PDF type format. So you'll see that usually within 24 to 48 hours. So with that said, we'd like to see if anyone has any questions for us. I haven't seen any come across during the presentation, so we'll give it another minute or so. You can click the question mark and type in your question. We can certainly answer those now or on an individual basis if it's more concerning a specific scenario for your credit union that may be different from other credit unions. And I don't see any questions popping up, so we will call it a day. Thank you very much for attending our CECL webinar today. Time's almost up for CECL, so if you are interested, please reach out. We will most likely give you a call as well, just touch base with you to see if we can help in any way possible as far as CECL. But I'd like to thank Steve Huntington and everybody else on the call today. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.